The rope hit Clarence Monroe square across the chest before he even understood that he was dying. The water was brown and absolute, the kind of flood that did not negotiate, that did not pause to consider the particulars of a man's circumstances or the weight of his sins. It had come down through the canyon walls of Red Mesa Gorge with a sound like the earth tearing itself open, and Clarence had been in the belly of it for what felt like forever but had probably been less than a minute, and he was losing. He was losing badly. His fingers had found a lip of sandstone and held, and the current tore at his legs like something alive, like something with hunger and intention, and the sandstone was crumbling under his grip, one grain at a time. He was 31 years old, and he had survived 6 years of drifting across New Mexico territory, and he had survived a knife fight in Tucson, and a blizzard outside of Santa Fe, and a crooked card game in Las Cruces that had nearly ended with a bullet between his eyes, and he was going to drown in 6 feet of muddy canyon water because he had made the catastrophic mistake of cutting through Red Mesa Gorge in late August, which was the absolute peak of the monsoon season, which every single person with any sense avoided, and then the rope. It landed across his chest with a crack, and he grabbed it with both hands before the rational part of his brain had even processed what it was, because the animal part of his brain understood ropes and knew what they meant and was not about to question the miracle. He wrapped his wrists once, twice, felt the rough hemp bite into his skin, and held. The rope went taut. Whoever was on the other end of that rope was holding against the full force of the Colorado River's younger and more furious cousin, holding against 200 pounds of waterlogged drifter and 3 days of rain in the mountains above, and they were holding. Clarence pulled himself hand over hand, the water fighting him every inch, his arms screaming, his lungs already half full of river, and when his boots finally found purchase on a shelf of rock just below the surface, he shoved himself forward and got his chest onto solid ground and coughed water from his body like a man emptying a bucket. He lay there for 10 seconds, 20, breathing. Then he turned over and looked up at the person who had just saved his life. She was standing 6 feet back from the canyon's edge, with the rope wound around the saddle horn of a dun mare who was set back on her haunches and straining. The horse doing most of the work that Clarence had mistakenly assumed was human strength. The woman's boots were planted in the red clay, and her hat was pushed back, and she was coiling the remaining rope with the quick, economical movements of someone who had done this exact thing before, or something very like it. She was perhaps 26, 27 years old, dark copper hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen real weather, green eyes that were currently performing a medical assessment of his entire body with a calm and focused efficiency that was both impressive and slightly unnerving. She did not look particularly relieved that he was alive. She looked, if anything, mildly irritated. "Broken," she said. He blinked water out of his eyes. "What? Anything broken? Arms, legs, ribs? Can you feel your hands?" He squeezed his fists. "Yes." "Good. Sit up slowly." He sat up. The world tilted and then steadied. The floodwater was still roaring 6 feet below them, red and furious, carrying everything that had been in the canyon before the storm arrived. "My horse," he said, and his voice came out wrong, hollowed out by water and shock. "The bay," she said, already turning to look downstream. She shaded her eyes with one hand. "She made it to the south bench. I can see her. She's standing." Clarence turned and squinted through the rain, which was still coming down in curtains, and after a moment he saw the pale shape of his horse on a narrow ledge of rock about 200 yards downstream, sides heaving, very much alive. He let out a breath that he had not known he was holding. "Bleeding," the woman said, and crouched beside him with a practicality that would have been startling in a drawing room but seemed entirely appropriate here, in the rain, in the canyon, in the aftermath of almost dying. She had a leather satchel open beside her knee, and she was already taking out a roll of cotton bandaging. "Above your ear. Head wounds bleed dramatically, but this one is shallow. You hit the canyon wall on the way through." "I don't remember that," he said. "You wouldn't," she said. "Hold still." He held still and let a stranger clean a wound on his head in the rain beside a flooding canyon in the middle of August, 1887, in the territory of New Mexico, and he had a strange and specific feeling that his life had just pivoted on something very small, on the width of a rope, on the question of whether one particular woman had been close enough to throw it. Her name, he would learn, was Charlotte Keene, and she would become the most significant fact of his life. But before any of that could happen, there were 2 weeks of hard weather, a conspiracy in the town of Raydrock, a secret that Charlotte had been carrying alone for 3 years, and a moment in a torchlit stable when Clarence Monroe would feel the world rearrange itself around a woman throwing a rope, of all things, and understand for the first time what it meant to be truly and completely undone. Clarence Monroe had come to New Mexico territory by way of Arkansas originally, and then by way of every place that could be briefly called home before some combination of restlessness and circumstance required moving on. He had worked cattle drives and mining camps, and one memorable winter as a freighter carrying goods between Albuquerque and the silver towns of the southern mountains. He was good with horses and better with silence, and reasonably skilled with both a rope and a rifle, though he had not fired a rifle at a person in 4 years, and intended to keep that particular streak going as long as possible. He had come through Red Mesa Gorge, because the main road between Gallup and Raydrock was 3 days longer, and he was running low on supplies, and had made the error of assuming that the sky's particular shade of gray that morning indicated rain rather than catastrophe. He had been wrong about that in a way that nearly ended his story entirely. Charlotte Keene had come through Red Mesa Gorge because she went everywhere in the canyon country that needed going to, because she was the only practicing healer within 40 miles of Raydrock, and because a Navajo family at the south end of the canyon had sent word 3 days ago that their eldest daughter had developed a fever that was not breaking. Charlotte had been making the trip anyway when the storm system moved in faster than expected, and she had been on the canyon rim road rather than the canyon floor because she knew better, which was the precise circumstance that had positioned her to see a man being swept along by the flood like a piece of driftwood. She had acted without deliberation, which was her way. Analysis and action were not separate events in Charlotte's mind. She assessed and moved simultaneously, which was why she was still alive and functional after 3 years of practicing medicine alone on the frontier, and why Clarence Monroe was not currently drowning. They made it to the canyon rim and found what shelter they could beneath an overhang of red rock while the storm continued. Charlotte's mare, whose name was Dorado, stood with patient resignation against the rock wall, and Charlotte worked on Clarence's head wound properly with better light and steadier hands now that they were not both being rained on directly. "You're not a doctor," Clarence said. It was not quite a question. "I am not," she agreed. "I am a healer. I studied with Dr. Elias Keene for 7 years. He was my mentor and my father figure, not my blood relation." She said this with the precision of someone who had clarified it many times before. "He passed 4 years ago and left me his practice and his medical library and his instruments. I have been practicing here since. By yourself. By myself." He stopped. Unusual, she did not look up from his wound. Difficult, inappropriate, I have heard all of them. "I was going to say impressive," he said. She did look up then briefly, and something in her expression shifted in a way that was hard to read, as though she had braced for a different word and the one he used had caught her off balance. "Hold still," she said again, and went back to work. The storm continued through the afternoon and into the evening, and they were not going anywhere. Charlotte had enough provisions for 2 in her saddlebags, as was her habit, because her work took her into situations where being stranded was a genuine possibility, and she planned accordingly. She had a small stove that could be assembled from 3 cast iron pieces, and she had coffee and dried meat and a tin of hard biscuits, and she set these things out with the same efficient economy of motion that characterized everything she did. Clarence watched her set up the small camp, and felt an uncomfortable awareness that he was contributing almost nothing to this situation. He offered to gather what dry wood was available under the overhang, and she directed him to a specific spot where she had already noted a cache of relatively dry deadfall, which he retrieved and felt mildly proud of having done, which was a new feeling. "Where were you heading?" she asked when they were eating, the rain still drumming on the rock above them. "Reed Rock," he said. "I heard there was work. Ranching operation, a man named Garrett." Charlotte's expression did not change visibly, but something shifted behind her eyes. A tightening. "Samuel Garrett," she said. "You know him." "Everyone in the territory knows Samuel Garrett," she said. "He owns the largest cattle operation in the region. He also has a significant amount of influence over the town of Reed Rock and the county government and the land office." She paused. "The kind of influence that tends to operate in ways that are not entirely transparent." Clarence looked at her steadily. "That sounds like something said carefully." "I say most things carefully," she agreed. "It is a useful habit." "What kind of things does Garrett do?" he said, and it was not quite a question either. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet he could see the shape of a decision being made. She was deciding how much to tell a stranger she had found in a flood. He could see the calculation happening behind those green eyes, and he found himself hoping, for reasons he could not immediately justify, that she would decide to trust him. "There are families in the canyon country," she said finally, "who have been here for generations. Navajo families and Mexican families whose ancestors received land grants from the Spanish crown. In the past 3 years, several of those families have lost their land through legal mechanisms that look legitimate on paper but require a particular kind of scrutiny to question." She picked at a biscuit. "The scrutiny that would be required tends to be expensive, and lawyers are not common in Reed Rock." "Garrett is taking their land," Clarence said. "Garrett is acquiring their land through processes that are legal according to the current administration of the land office," she said, "which is run by a man named Everett Poole, who is Garrett's wife's cousin, and who moved into the position 8 months ago when the previous land officer retired unexpectedly to Arizona Territory." She paused. "The previous land officer was named Thomas Webb, and he and I had a significant disagreement about whether certain land grant documents were genuine before he left." Clarence set down his coffee tin. "That sounds like it was dangerous." "It was somewhat uncomfortable," she agreed, which was, he was already beginning to understand Charlotte Keene's way of describing something that had been considerably worse than uncomfortable. "I have copies of certain documents. I have been corresponding with a law firm in Santa Fe for 14 months. Progress has been slow." He was quiet for a moment. "And now you're telling a stranger all of this." "I am telling you enough that you understand what Reed Rock is," she said. "Because you are about to ride into it looking for work from the man at the center of the problem. And you look like someone who might benefit from that information." "Or," he said, "you are telling me enough to find out whether I am someone who works for Garrett and was sent to find out whether you are a problem." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you?" "No," he said. She studied him with those focused green eyes. "I did not think so," she said. "You do not have the particular quality of men who work for Garrett. They tend to have a certain look, a practiced indifference to the world around them that is quite distinct from genuine independence." "And what do I have?" he said, and was surprised to find he was genuinely curious about her answer. "You have the look of a man who has been watching his own back for so long that he's forgotten there might be anything worth looking toward," she said simply, and returned to her biscuit, as though she had not just said something that landed in his chest like a stone dropped into water. The storm broke sometime near midnight, and by dawn the canyon was draining, the floodwater receding back to its ordinary dimensions, which in August meant a trickle along the canyon floor between walls of red and orange sandstone 400 feet high. Clarence's horse, whose name was Kestrel, had made it through the night on her ledge and was retrieved without great difficulty, once the water was low enough to allow passage. She was scraped along one shoulder and missing a saddlebag, but alive and sound, which under the circumstances was a remarkable outcome. They rode toward Redrock together because the road was the same road, and because Charlotte had still not completed her visit to the family at the south end of the canyon. He rode alongside her, and she was, he discovered, not a woman given to idle talk, but neither was she unfriendly. When she spoke, it was usually because she had something specific to say, and the specific things she said tended to be worth listening to. She had observations about the landscape that were both practical and precise, the way she noted which plants were growing where, and what that indicated about the soil and the water table, the way she read the weather in the afternoon clouds building over the mountains with an accuracy that he had never seen in anyone who was not raised to it. "Where did you learn all of this?" he asked when she predicted a small thunderstorm that arrived exactly when she said it would. "Doctor." Keene believed that a healer had to understand the environment their patients lived in, she said. Climate, soil, water sources, plant life. He said you could not treat a body in isolation from the world that body inhabited. "He sounds like a remarkable man." "He was the finest person I ever knew," she said, and the simplicity of it carried a grief that was not fresh but was permanent, the kind of grief that has been lived with long enough to be carried quietly. "Your parents?" he asked, and then felt suddenly that it was presumptuous, but she answered without hesitation. "My father died when I was 11. My mother remarried and moved to Ohio, and we were not well suited to each other after that. Dr. Keene took me on as an apprentice when I was 16. I had been helping the local doctor in my town for 2 years already, and he said I had more knowledge than most men twice my age." A pause. He was exaggerating, but it was the kind of exaggeration that gives a person direction. "You were not lonely," Clarence said, and then regretted that too. Charlotte looked at him sideways from beneath her hat brim. "Are you asking me whether I am lonely now?" "I suppose I am," he said, because there was no point in retreating once a question was already visible. She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of evasion but the silence of honest consideration. "There is a difference between solitude and loneliness," she said. "I chose this work in this place deliberately. I am useful here in a way I would not be elsewhere. That is not loneliness." Another pause, smaller. "There are moments." He did not push further, but the words settled in him somewhere and stayed. They reached the Navajo family settlement in the early afternoon, and Charlotte became immediately and entirely a different kind of present. She dismounted before Kestrel had fully stopped and had her satchel open before Clarence had even tied his horse. And the family who came out to meet them clearly knew her and trusted her in the specific way that people trust someone who has repeatedly proven themselves reliable in moments of genuine crisis. The daughter, whose name was Ayanna and who was perhaps 14 years old, had a fever of the kind that was currently circling through the territory, a strain of influenza that had been making rounds since spring. It was serious but manageable with careful treatment, and Charlotte had seen it before and knew its course. Clarence stood back and watched Charlotte work, and what he saw was not what he expected. He had expected competence. She had demonstrated competence already, clearly and thoroughly. What he had not expected was the quality of her attention, the way she was simultaneously present to the medical reality of the situation and to the human reality, the way she spoke to Ayanna directly and treated her like an intelligent person who deserved to understand her own condition, the way she communicated with the girl's mother through a combination of Spanish and the limited Navajo she had taught herself, the way she explained exactly what she was doing at each step and why. He had seen doctors. He had been in plenty of frontier towns with plenty of frontier doctors, and the competent ones were not always kind, and the kind ones were not always competent. And here was someone who was both with such thoroughness that it seemed almost unconscious, as though any other approach would simply not have occurred to her. She administered a preparation she mixed from her own supplies, willow bark for the fever and something else she did not identify aloud, and she showed Ayanna's mother how to prepare it and how often to administer it and what to watch for over the next 3 days. She left behind enough material for a full week of treatment. She refused the family's offers of payment with a simple directness that was not condescending but was absolute. On the ride out, Clarence was quiet for longer than usual. "She will recover," Charlotte said, reading his expression. "The fever will break by tomorrow evening. She is young and strong." "I know," he said. "That's not what I was thinking about." She looked at him. "You didn't charge them," he said. "I rarely charge the families in the canyon country," she said. "They have very little and I have enough." "How do you have enough?" "The ranchers and the merchants in Red Rock pay adequately," she said, "and I manage carefully. Dr. Keene left me his instruments and his library, which are worth considerable money to me functionally and nothing in a market this small, so I have no temptation to sell them. My needs are not complicated." He thought about this. "Most people in your position would see an opportunity to profit." "Most people in my position are men," she said, matter-of-factly and without particular heat. "And the expectation is that a man in medicine is building toward something. I am not building toward a larger practice in a larger city. I am here. This is what I am building." She gestured, one economical sweep of her arm that took in the canyon country and the Red Rock and the families who lived in it. "I find that purpose is considerably more sustaining than profit." Clarence was quiet again. "You think that is naive," she said. "No," he said. "I think it is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years." She looked at him for a moment, and this time the thing that shifted in her expression was less guarded. Not open, not yet, but the beginning of something unlocked. Red Rock was a town of perhaps 400 people sitting at the junction of two wagon roads in a broad valley between canyon walls. The kind of town that existed because the terrain required a stopping point. There was a main street with the standard institutions: a general store, a saloon, a livery, a hotel, a church, and a building that served as both the land office and the courthouse. There was a small clinic at the eastern edge of town, which was Charlotte's, a converted house with a sign that read simply "C. Keene, Healer" in black paint on white board. Clarence noticed the sign and noticed that several people on the main street noted Charlotte's return with the particular quality of attention given to someone who is both respected and watched. "The town knows what you've been doing," he said quietly as they rode in. "Regarding Garrett, the town has a range of opinions about it," she said. "Some people are grateful, some are frightened. Some believe that I am overstepping in ways that will cause more harm than good. Some believe I am simply wrong about what Garrett is doing." She paused. "And some people who work for Garrett have made it clear that they would prefer my attentions directed elsewhere." "Has anyone threatened you directly?" "I have had 3 separate conversations," she said carefully, "in which men whose names I know to be connected to Garrett's operation made comments about the difficulties that can arise for a woman living alone in this territory." A pause. "I took those comments as the intended warnings and adjusted my precautions accordingly." He looked at her. "What precautions?" "I keep my doors locked," she said. "I do not travel at night when it can be avoided. I have a very good rifle and I am an adequate shot, and I am careful about what I say to whom." She met his eyes briefly. "Until I have a reason to be less careful." Which was, he understood, a statement about him. They parted at the junction of the main street with a formality that felt slightly absurd, given that she had recently saved his life, and Clarence rode to the livery to stable Kestrel, and then to the hotel to secure a room, and then stood in the street outside the hotel, and looked at the town of Red Rock, and understood that he had arrived somewhere more complicated than a simple work opportunity. He had also arrived somewhere that contained Charlotte Keene, who was not simple in any dimension he had yet identified, and who had said things to him in a canyon in a rainstorm that he was still turning over like coins found on a road, examining the edges. He went to look for work. The foreman at Garrett's ranch was a broad, weathered man named Pete Calloway, who hired Clarence on the strength of his references and his demonstrated skill with a rope during what Pete called a practical assessment, which was in practice a test involving a pen of nervous steers and a very short window of time. Clarence had worked cattle since he was 18, and he passed without difficulty, and was told to report to the bunkhouse the following Monday. This gave him several days in Red Rock, which he spent in ways that were partly practical and partly something else he did not immediately name. He bought new provisions at the general store and had Kestrel reshod at the livery, and bought himself a clean shirt because his only other one had been in the lost saddlebag. He ate at the small restaurant beside the hotel and was surprised to find that the cook was genuinely skilled. He sat in the saloon one evening and listened to the conversations around him and learned a great deal about the texture of the town. And on the second day, he found himself standing outside Charlotte's clinic at 11 in the morning, with a tin of coffee that he had bought at the general store and no clear explanation for why he was standing there. She opened the door before he knocked because she had seen him from the window and looked at the coffee tin with an expression that was trying to remain neutral and was not entirely succeeding. "I thought you might not have had time to buy supplies since we got back," he said. It was a weak explanation and he knew it. "I have supplies," she said. "Then I thought you might have room for additional supplies." She looked at him for a moment and then stepped back from the door. "Come in then," she said. "I have bread from this morning." Her clinic was exactly what he would have expected from the rest of her, organized with precision, everything in its place, instruments cleaned and covered, medicine bottles labeled in a clear hand on a set of shelves that ran the full length of one wall. But it was also unmistakably personal. There were books everywhere that were not medical texts, novels and histories, and a series of journals whose spines were worn with use. There was a drawing on the wall above her desk, charcoal on brown paper of the canyon country as seen from the rim, and it was good, genuinely good. "You drew that," he said. She glanced at it. "Yes, drawing is useful for medical illustration. I keep my hand in." "It's more than useful," he said. "It's beautiful." She turned away to slice the bread and he could not see her face. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me what you learned about the town." He sat and they talked for 2 hours. This became, over the following days, a pattern. He came to the clinic in the mornings when she had no patients, and they talked over coffee or tea or whatever Charlotte had available. And she asked him precise questions about what he was observing in the town, and he answered honestly. And she added context, and the picture of Red Rock assembled itself between them like a surveyor's map being drawn in real time. He learned that Garrett had acquired 7 properties in 3 years, 5 of them from families of Navajo or Mexican heritage, and that the legal mechanism involved a provision of territorial law related to delinquent taxes that was technically legitimate, but required knowing how to trigger it, which Garrett's man at the land office could do. He learned that Thomas Webb, the previous land officer, had refused to cooperate with this mechanism, and had subsequently found himself the subject of a complaint to the territorial government about irregularities in his records, complaints that turned out to be manufactured, but that had been enough to force his resignation. He learned that Charlotte had been in correspondence with Webb as well as with the Santa Fe law firm, and that she had documented evidence of at least 3 of the acquisitions being based on fraudulent tax assessments. He also learned that she made bread on Sunday mornings, and that she had a particular fondness for coffee made strong enough to serve as a structural material, and that she had read everything in the territory's limited book supply at least twice, and that she had strong and specific opinions about everything from the territorial land laws to the medicinal properties of various desert plants, to the particular way the afternoon light moved across the canyon walls in late summer. He was aware that he was falling in love with her in the specific, unhurried way that tended to be permanent rather than provisional. He had loved women before, or something he had called love at the time. There had been a woman in Albuquerque 2 years ago who had mattered to him genuinely and who had married a merchant with a fixed address, which was what she needed and what Clarence could not provide. There had been others, shorter and less substantial. What was happening with Charlotte Keene was different in its texture, denser and more specific, made of particular things rather than general feeling. It was made of the way she said, "Hold still," and meant it as both instruction and reassurance simultaneously. It was made of the way she corrected him when he was wrong about something without condescension, simply and directly, as a matter of record. It was made of the particular quality of her silences, which were never empty but always occupied with something. He had not done anything about this awareness. He was not certain she would welcome it, and he was not willing to make an error that would cost him her company, which he had discovered was one of the most valuable things currently in his life. On his first Monday on the Garrett Ranch, he began to understand that Charlotte's concerns were both well-founded and more urgent than she had perhaps communicated. The ranch operation was large and well-run on its surface, a genuine working cattle business with several hundred head and competent management. But there were currents underneath that surface that became visible over time to a person paying attention. There were conversations that stopped when certain men entered. There were riders who went out at odd hours without explanation. There was a building on the south end of the property that he was told to ignore and which he noticed received deliveries after dark. There was a man named Voss who was not technically a ranch hand, but who was always present, always armed, and who had the specific quality of stillness that Clarence associated with professional violence. He reported these observations to Charlotte over coffee on Wednesday morning and watched her face. "Voss," she said. "You know him. He has been in Redrock for 8 months," she said, "since Poole arrived at the land office. He is not from the territory. I do not know his origin." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Webb told me before he left that there was a man who visited Garrett twice in the month before his removal who was not local and who made Webb significantly uncomfortable. The description matches. Garrett brought him in to manage the coercive aspect of the operation," Clarence said. "That is my assessment also," she said. He leaned forward. "Charlotte, you need to understand that what you're sitting on is not just a land dispute. If Voss is what I think he is, and Garrett is using him the way I think he's being used, then your documents and your correspondence are a significant threat to people who are accustomed to resolving threats forcefully." She looked at him steadily. "I am aware of that," she said. "I have been aware of that for some time." "Are you afraid?" The question sat between them for a moment. "Yes," she said, which cost her something. He could see it. "I am afraid. I am afraid every time I go out at night for a patient call and every time a stranger comes to the clinic. But I am more afraid of what happens to those families if I stop." She held his gaze. "Fear is not the same as paralysis." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "it is not." He went back to the ranch that afternoon and started paying very careful attention indeed. What crystallized the situation was an incident 3 weeks into his time at the ranch. On a Thursday evening when he was coming back from a supply run to Redrock and saw Voss and 2 other men ride out of town in the direction of the canyon country, in the direction of the Navajo settlements, at an hour that was not consistent with any legitimate ranch business. He followed them, at distance, in the gathering dusk. What he witnessed in the next hour was a conversation that was conducted at the edge of a family's property with a quality of threat that was unmistakable even from 200 yards. The positioning of horses, the visible firearms, the way the family's patriarch stood between Voss and his family's house with a posture that communicated both defiance and terror. He could not hear the words from his position, but he did not need to hear them. He had seen this conversation in other forms before. He rode back to Redrock and went directly to Charlotte's clinic and knocked on the door at 9 in the evening, and when she opened it he told her what he had seen and watched her face go through a series of expressions that ended at something cold and resolved. "The Begay family," she said. "They are the last of the 7. Garrett has been trying to acquire their land for 6 months. He's moving to finalize it," Clarence said. "Whatever legal mechanism they're going to use, they're preparing to use it soon." Charlotte turned and went to her desk, and began pulling documents from a locked drawer. "I have been waiting for confirmation of the tax assessment manipulation," she said, sorting through papers with quick hands. "I have most of it. The Santa Fe firm needs one more piece, which is a comparison of the actual assessment records against the reported figures. That document is in the land office." Clarence was very still. "In the land office?" "Yes." She looked up. "Which is locked at night and occupied by Everett Poole during the day. Poole knows me by sight and would not allow me access." He looked at her, she looked at him. The same calculation was visible in both their faces. "I can get into the land office," he said. "That is illegal," she said. "So is manufacturing tax assessments to steal land from people who have lived on it for generations," he said. She held his gaze. Something in her expression shifted, a final resolution, a door opened. "The records room is at the back of the building," she said. "The window on the north side has a broken latch. I noticed it 2 weeks ago." A pause. "I was not planning to act on that information alone." "But you were keeping it," he said. "I keep most things," she said. He went that night, moved through the dark streets of Raydrock with the particular quality of invisibility that came from years of moving through places where being noticed was dangerous. Found the window, found it exactly as she had described, found the records room. He worked by moonlight and the small stub of candle he had brought, found the assessment records, found the discrepancies exactly as Charlotte had described them, made careful copies by hand of the relevant figures, replaced everything precisely as he had found it, and was back at Charlotte's clinic by 11:30. She was at her desk with a lamp burning, a pen in her hand, clearly having been composing something while she waited. She looked up when he came in, and the relief on her face was quickly controlled but not quickly enough. "You were worried," he said. "You took longer than I expected," she said. "I was thorough," he said, and laid the copied figures on her desk. She looked at them for a long moment, running her finger down the columns with an expert eye, and then she set them down and closed her eyes for just a second. And when she opened them, he thought she might be the most striking person he had ever seen in his life, sitting there in lamplight with 3 years of careful work finally arriving at something complete. "This is what we needed," she said. He sat down across from her. "How fast can you get it to Santa Fe?" "I can have a letter out with the morning stage," she said. 14 days to receive a response if they move quickly. They have been ready to file for 2 months. They were only waiting for this." "Can the Begay family hold for 14 days?" "I do not know," she said honestly. "I need to go to them tomorrow and explain what is happening. They deserve to know." He was quiet for a moment. "I will come with you." She looked at him. "You do not need to." "I know," he said. "I want to." The silence between them stretched in a different direction than silences usually went, weighted with something that had been accumulating for weeks and was now pressing against the surface of things. "Clarence," she said, and his name in her mouth was a different word than it usually was. "Yes," he said simply. "I do not know what you intend to do after this is resolved," she said. "You came to Raydrock looking for work, and staying on Garrett's ranch is clearly no longer a suitable arrangement given everything we have just done." She paused. "I do not want to build a reliance on your presence that is not warranted." He leaned forward and rested his arms on the edge of her desk. "What would make it warranted?" She looked at him with those direct green eyes, and he could see the precision of her mind working, and also something else, something less calculated, something that was simply feeling expressed in the particular language of someone who had learned to translate all feeling into careful words. "I have been alone for 3 years," she said. "I have managed it well. I have not been in need of rescue or assistance. I do not require someone to manage my life or my work or my safety." "I know that," he said. "I have had 3 weeks to observe it firsthand. You are the most capable person I have encountered in 6 years of drifting through this territory, and I do not say that lightly." "Then what are you saying?" she said. "I am saying," he said carefully, "that there is a difference between not needing something and not wanting it. And that what I feel when I am in this room with you is not the feeling of someone useful to a project. It is the feeling of someone who wants to stay." She was very still. "Not because you need me to stay," he continued. "Because being here with you is the first time in years that a place has felt like somewhere I wanted to be rather than somewhere I was passing through." The lamp between them was very steady and the night outside was very quiet, the desert quiet that was not silence but a different register of sound entirely. "I need to think," she said. "That seems entirely reasonable," he said and stood up. "I will see you in the morning." He went back to his hotel room and lay in the dark for a long time, and the dark was not uncomfortable. He reported to the ranch in the morning as scheduled, said nothing unusual to anyone, and worked through the day with the particular double awareness of someone who is playing a part, while knowing that the part has a limited timeline. He was careful with Voss, whose eyes tracked movement in a space the way a predator's eyes tracked movement, and he was careful with Calloway, who was not a bad man but who was loyal in the way of men who did not think too carefully about where that loyalty pointed. Charlotte had gone to the Begay family that morning as planned, and he had not gone with her because going together on that day would have been conspicuous, and they had both made the calculation independently and reached the same conclusion, which was one of the things that continued to astonish him about her. She was back at the clinic by afternoon, and he came by in the evening, and she reported that the Begay family understood the situation and were prepared to hold their ground, and that she had given them documentation of their rights and contacts in the territorial network that she had been quietly building for 3 years. "You have been building a network," he said. "I treat people across a 40-mile radius," she said. "After enough time, people who trust you will connect you to other people who trust you, and a network is simply the natural result of trust extended over time and distance. And they are all part of this. Many of them have their own concerns about Garrett or about the land office or about the quality of representation available to them through the official mechanisms of the territory," she said. "I have been a conduit for information and documentation. I am not the leader of anything organized. I am simply someone who knows people and keeps records." He shook his head slowly. "What?" she said. "You came down from that canyon rim," he said, "in a monsoon storm, carrying a rope and a medical satchel, and when I got myself out of the water I thought the remarkable thing was the rope. But the rope is almost the smallest thing about you." The expression on her face was unlike any expression he had seen from her before. It was unguarded in a way that she rarely permitted, and he could see in it the shape of how much it mattered to be seen clearly by someone, not as a curiosity or an anomaly or a problem to be managed, but simply seen. "It is a very good rope technique," she said. "It is an exceptional rope technique," he agreed. "But so is the rest of it." She stood up from her desk and walked to the window and looked out at the dark street for a moment. When she turned back, the decision was visible in her posture. "I have thought about what you said last night," she said. "I assumed you would. You are correct that there is a difference between not needing something and not wanting it," she said. "I have been careful not to want things that seemed unavailable or impractical. 3 years ago I made a decision that this work in this place was the right life for me, and I have not regretted it. But I made that decision in the absence of any prospect of it containing something else." He waited. "I do not know how to do this carefully," she said. "I know how to do almost everything carefully. I find that I cannot apply the same methodology here." "Then do not apply the methodology," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she crossed the room to him and he stood to meet her, and when she put her hands on his face, it was with the same focused and absolute quality of attention she gave everything, and the kiss was brief and certain, like a diagnosis made with complete confidence. He put his arms around her and held her for a moment in the lamplit clinic among the medicine bottles and the medical library and the drawing of the canyon on the wall, and he felt something in himself that had been moving for 6 years settle into stillness. The letter went out on the morning stage as planned. In the 2 weeks that followed, they were careful in public, not secretive exactly, but measured, because Charlotte's standing in the town was a professional and strategic asset, and neither of them wanted to introduce unnecessary complication into an already complicated situation. But in the evenings he came to the clinic and they talked for hours, ranging across subjects with a range and freedom that he had not experienced in conversation since he was young, and believed that other people might be infinitely interesting, a belief he had subsequently abandoned and now found inexplicably restored. She told him about her childhood in Missouri and the particular geography of loneliness that came from being more intelligent than most of the people around you in circumstances that did not reward intelligence. She told him about Dr. Keene finding her at 17, and the precise quality of the recognition that had passed between a brilliant and unconventional man and a brilliant and unconventional girl, the recognition of one genuinely peculiar person by another. She told him about her years as his apprentice and student and eventually colleague, and the slow accumulation of medical knowledge that had given her both a vocation and a framework for understanding the world. He told her things he had not told anyone. He told her about his family in Arkansas, and the father who had been kind and the mother who had been brilliant, and the farm that had been sold to pay debts when he was 22, and the understanding that had come to him then that the world was not organized around fairness, and that a person either found a way to live with that or found a way to fight it, and that he had spent 6 years doing neither very consistently. "What do you want?" she asked him one evening. "Not what you have been doing. What you actually want." He thought about it honestly. "I want to be useful," he said, "in a way that is connected to something real. Not just moving from place to place doing work that gets done and then there's no trace of it." He looked at his hands. "I want to be somewhere." "You are somewhere," she said. "You are here." "I know," he said. "That is becoming clear to me." The response from the Santa Fe law firm arrived on the 14th day, which Charlotte had predicted within a 12-hour window. It was a letter from the senior partner of the firm, indicating that the documents she had provided were sufficient to file a formal complaint with the territorial court, that they were prepared to file immediately, and that the territorial governor's office had been made aware of the situation and was inclined to take a serious interest in the operation of the Redrock Land Office. She read it to him in the morning, her voice controlled and steady, and when she finished she set the letter on her desk and sat with her hands folded and was quiet for a long moment. "It is not over," she said. "The legal process will take months. Garrett has resources and will fight it. The families may face additional pressure in the interim. But it has begun," he said. "It has begun," she agreed. He reached across the desk and covered her folded hands with his. She turned one hand over and held his. They did not immediately encounter consequences, which was its own kind of tension, the sense of something that had been set in motion whose full weight had not yet arrived. Clarence continued at the ranch for another week, watching and listening, and what he heard was a change in tone among Garrett's inner circle, a tightness that had not been there before. Word had apparently reached them that something had moved in Santa Fe, though the specifics were not yet clear to them. Voss came to town on a Wednesday and walked the length of the main street and went into the land office and was in there for an hour, and came out with a face that was still professionally blank, but with a quality of movement that was slightly more accelerated than usual. Clarence watched this from the doorway of the general store and then went to find Charlotte. She was treating a rancher's wife for a broken wrist when he arrived, and he waited in her small front room that served as a waiting area. And while he waited, a man he did not know came in and sat across from him and looked at him with an expression that was assessing rather than neutral. When Charlotte came out and saw the man, her expression changed in a specific way. "Mr. Croft," she said. "Miss Keene," the man said. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the territory, with the manner of someone accustomed to managing situations. "I wonder if we might speak." "My associate can stay," she said, and the steadiness of her voice was remarkable. Croft looked at Clarence and made a calculation and apparently decided not to object. "I represent certain business interests in the region," he said. There is concern about the nature of some recent communications with the territorial capital. The concern is that certain information may have been conveyed that is inaccurate or incomplete, and that this might result in disruption to operations that are in fact entirely legitimate. I am a healer, Charlotte said. I treat patients. I do not know what communications you are referring to. Of course, Croft said. He smiled in a way that indicated he knew exactly what she knew, and she knew that he knew. I simply came to say that there are people in this region who value stability and who would be willing to demonstrate that value in practical ways, to people who contribute to stability. He was offering her money to stop. I appreciate your visit, Charlotte said. I believe I am fully occupied with the health needs of this community and have nothing to offer your interests. Good day, Mr. Croft. He left with a different quality of movement than Voss, smooth rather than accelerated, which was somehow more concerning. When the door closed, Clarence looked at her. That was more direct than I expected, he said. It means they are more concerned than I expected, she said. Which means the filing in Santa Fe has created more visibility than they anticipated. She sat down. They will now try to determine what documents were used and where they came from. The copies I made were careful, he said. There is nothing in the land office records that would indicate they were examined. Nevertheless, I think you should not return to the ranch, she said. Calloway already suspects something because you have been less available in the evenings. Voss is thorough. He will investigate the people connected to me. He was quiet for a moment. If I leave the ranch without explanation, it looks like flight. If you stay and Voss connects you to the Santa Fe filing, it may be significantly worse than flight, she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and between them was the particular clarity of two people who have been honest with each other and have therefore arrived at an honest assessment of the situation. I can handle Voss, he said. I know you believe that, she said. I am asking you to consider whether it needs to be handled rather than avoided. He considered it. I will give notice at the ranch, he said. Claim a family situation. It is thin, but it is better than nothing. And then, she said. And then I am no longer employed on the Garrett Ranch, and am available to be present in Reed Rock in whatever capacity is useful, he said. Something in her expression was both grateful and searching. I do not want you to stay because the situation is dangerous, she said. I want you to stay because you want to. Charlotte, he said, I am going to stay. I was going to stay before there was a situation. The situation is incidental. She held his gaze. All right, she said. He gave notice at the ranch the next morning. Calloway was skeptical and showed it, and Clarence maintained his story with the consistency that came from long practice at operating in circumstances where the truth was not available, and something else had to serve. He collected his final pay and his gear, and rode Kestrel back to Reed Rock, and took his hotel room for another week, and then, because the hotel was expensive and inconvenient, and because Charlotte's clinic had a back room with a cot that she used on nights when she needed to stay close to a patient, the arrangement evolved with a natural logic that neither of them articulated but both of them understood. He was not in the clinic as a patient or a guest exactly. He was there as someone who belonged there, and the belonging had its own grammar that they developed together over the following weeks, the grammar of two people who are genuinely suited to each other, learning the specific vocabulary of daily life shared. He took over the practical maintenance of the clinic building, which had needs that Charlotte had been managing intermittently and that he could address properly, and he took on the role of escort for her canyon country rounds, which gave him legitimate reason to know the terrain and the families and the network she had built over 3 years. He was useful in the ways a large and capable man is useful in circumstances where large and capable men are sometimes needed, and he was present in the ways she had not acknowledged needing until someone was present, and the difference became apparent. He also, without discussion, positioned himself between Charlotte and the particular quality of attention that Voss was directing her way. Voss had not made any direct move. He was too professional for that. But he was observing, and Charlotte was aware of being observed, and there was a quality of pressure in it that was wearing, like weather that stays in one pattern too long. The territorial court's response to the filing arrived 6 weeks after the initial communication, in the form of an official investigation order directed at the Redrock Land Office, and specifically at the appointment and conduct of Everett Poole. This arrived via the county sheriff, who was a man named Harris who was not under Garrett's influence, and who had privately communicated to Charlotte 3 months ago that he would welcome evidence sufficient to give him grounds to act. The investigation order gave Harris exactly that. Poole was removed from the land office within 48 hours, and an interim administrator sent from the capital. Voss left Redrock within a week of Poole's removal, which was either a sign of professionalism in cutting his losses or a sign that Garrett had cut him loose, but either way he was gone, and his absence changed the quality of the air in the town in ways that were almost physical. Garrett himself was served with notice of the territorial court's inquiry into the land acquisitions. He was not immediately charged with anything. The legal process was exactly as slow and complicated as Charlotte had described, and it would be several months before the full picture resolved. But the process had begun, and the pressure was now flowing in the opposite direction, and this was sufficient for the moment. The Begay family received formal notification that the tax assessment that had been used against their property was under investigation, and that no action could be taken against them pending the outcome. Charlotte read this notification to them herself, in their home, and Clarence stood outside with the horses and watched through the open door as the family's patriarch listened, and the relief moved through his body like a different kind of flood. On the ride back to Redrock, Charlotte was quiet for a long time, and he let her be quiet. When she finally spoke, she said, 3 years. Yes, he said. I did not know if it would come to anything, she said. I kept the records and maintained the correspondence and told myself it would come to something, but there were many times when I was not certain. It came to something, he said. We came to something, she said, and looked at him sideways. You and I, the documents from the land office, were the piece that was missing. You would have found another way, he said. Perhaps, she said, but not this way, not this fast. She was quiet again. I do not take what you risked lightly, Clarence. I know you do not, he said. You do not take anything lightly. She looked at him. Is that a fault? No, he said. It is one of the most specific things I love about you. He had not said the word before. He had felt it clearly and for some time, and she had certainly known it, but the word itself had not been deployed, and now it was out and between them in the warm afternoon air, and the canyon walls above them were turning gold in the slanting light. Charlotte did not immediately respond, which was her way with important things. She processed what mattered and then addressed it when she was ready, and he had learned to trust this rhythm. They were almost back to Redrock when she said, I love you also. Simply and directly, as a matter of record, in the same voice she used for diagnoses and assessments, and everything else that was important enough to be said with full precision. He reached over and took her hand across the space between their horses and held it. Good, he said. The winter was a significant adjustment in the canyon country, the monsoon season giving way to cold that settled into the rock, and the soil with a thoroughness that surprised people who had not experienced desert cold before. Clarence was surprised. He had wintered in plenty of places and had some sense of what cold meant, but the desert variety had its own character, dry and absolute, with nights that dropped to temperatures that made the thin clinic walls seem entirely insufficient. He addressed the clinic walls. He spent 3 weeks in November insulating and repairing and improving the building, with materials from the general store and assistance from a Navajo man named Thomas Runningwater, who was a skilled carpenter, and who owed Charlotte a series of debts. He was always glad to find opportunities to repay. The clinic emerged from this process substantially warmer and structurally sounder, and Charlotte observed the transformation with an expression that was both pleased and slightly overwhelmed. You did not need to do this, she said. I wanted to, he said. This is where we live. It should be adequate. She looked at him. This is where we live, she repeated, and the statement had a quality of something being received and recognized, something fitting into a place that had been waiting for it. If that is acceptable, he said. It is more than acceptable, she said. He proposed marriage on a Tuesday in December, practically and directly, in the kitchen of the clinic while they were eating dinner, which was entirely consistent with both of their characters, and which Charlotte later said was exactly the right way for it to have happened, because it was honest rather than theatrical. She said yes with the same directness she brought to everything. They were married in January by the circuit preacher who came through Raydrock every 6 weeks, in the clinic itself, because the weather was bad and Charlotte had patients she could not be far from. Sheriff Harris was present, and Thomas Runningwaiter and his family, and the families from the Canyon country who had made the trip, and the rancher's wife whose wrist Charlotte had set, and several other people who had reason to value Charlotte's presence and were glad to mark its formalization. Charlotte wore her cleanest dress, which was blue and practical, and Clarence wore a new shirt and his best coat, and the preacher performed the ceremony in 20 minutes and seemed genuinely moved by both the participants and the collection of people assembled to witness them, which had a quality that was not typical of frontier weddings, a quality of genuine community rather than mere ceremony. Afterward there was food that several people had brought, and which was collectively better than any meal available in Raydrock's restaurant, and there was conversation that ran late into the evening, and when everyone had gone home, Clarence looked at Charlotte across the lamplit room that was now their shared home, and felt something that did not have a simple name, but that was made of warmth and permanence, and the specific rightness of a thing that has arrived at exactly where it belongs. Spring brought new developments in the legal case, as the territorial court's investigation produced findings that were more damning than Charlotte had anticipated. Evidence of manufactured tax assessments emerged not just in Raydrock, but in 2 other counties in the territory, suggesting that what Garrett had been doing in Red Mesa Canyon country was part of a pattern applied elsewhere. The Santa Fe law firm's case expanded, and additional firms became involved, and the territorial governor issued a formal statement about the integrity of land grant claims that was clearly pointed at Garrett's operation. Garrett himself hired expensive legal counsel and began a rearguard action that would consume much of the following year, but the direction of the current had reversed, and he was moving against it rather than with it, and everyone in the territory who was paying attention understood this. 3 of the 7 families whose land had been acquired received it back in the spring court session. The other 4 cases were more complicated, involving subsequent transactions and competing claims, and would take longer to resolve. Charlotte reported this to the Begay family, and the others with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to everything. No false promises, no excessive optimism, but also no minimizing of what had been achieved. The Begay family's patriarch, a man named Henry Begay who had said very little in all of their interactions, said something to Charlotte on the morning she brought the first round of good news that she translated for Clarence later. He had told her that when the land office had first come for them, he had believed that the mechanisms of the territory were simply against them, and that there was no recourse, and that what she had done was not merely recover land but recover the possibility of recourse itself, the possibility that the law could sometimes point in the right direction if pushed hard enough. Charlotte had relayed this with a precise voice, and then had needed a moment before she could continue. The spring also brought a development of a different and personal nature. Charlotte told Clarence in April that she was pregnant, and she told him in the characteristic Charlotte Keene way, which was to say she informed him of the medical facts first, confirmed the diagnosis, provided a probable timeline, and then, having established the informational foundation, allowed herself a moment of something that was not quite professionally controlled. Clarence was holding her hands and she was looking at him with those green eyes, and whatever expression was on his face in that moment was one she would describe years later as the only time she had ever seen him completely at a loss for words. He recovered from the loss in approximately 4 seconds and then held her for a long time without saying anything because words were genuinely not adequate to the moment. "We will need a crib," she said into his shoulder. "I will build one," he said. "Thomas Runningwater will help," she said. "He will indeed," he said. The pregnancy proceeded with the same competent thoroughness that characterized Charlotte's approach to everything, which is to say, she monitored her own condition with precise attention and made appropriate adjustments to her practice load without entirely reducing it because she was, as she told Clarence when he expressed concern about her schedule, a healer who was pregnant rather than a fragile person who happened to be a healer. He understood the distinction and respected it, and channeled his concern into practical support rather than restriction, accompanying her on all Canyon Country calls and handling the physical aspects of travel that were increasingly uncomfortable for her in the later months. He also built the crib with Runningwater's assistance, out of pine from the mountains that he had the lumberyard bring down specially, and he built it with a quality of attention to detail that Charlotte noticed and found unexpectedly affecting. "You are going to be an extraordinary father," she said. "I intend to try," he said, which was his way of saying yes. Their son was born in November, on a Thursday, in the clinic that had become their home, delivered by Charlotte herself with Clarence's steadfast and increasingly pale presence throughout the process, and the assistance of a Navajo midwife named Rosa, whom Charlotte trusted completely. The birth was straightforward by the standards of frontier obstetrics, which meant it was exhausting and difficult, and then concluded with a healthy boy of strong lungs and considerable opinion about his new circumstances. They named him Elias for Dr. Keene. Elias Monroe was a child of specific and vocal preferences from the beginning, which was entirely consistent with his parentage, and which made him simultaneously exhausting and entertaining. He grew through his first year with the Canyon Country families as his extended community and Charlotte's clinic as his home landscape, learning to walk among the medicine bottles and the medical library and the drawing of the canyon on the wall. By the time Elias was walking steadily, the Garrett situation had reached its conclusion, more or less. Garrett had fought the territorial court process to its end, and had lost on 4 of the original 7 land acquisition cases, meaning those properties were returned. The other 3 cases remained in legal uncertainty for another 2 years before 2 were returned, and 1 was settled with financial compensation, which the family accepted because the practical cost of further litigation exceeded the value of the land itself, and Charlotte felt the imperfection of this outcome in a specific way that she carried for some time. Garrett himself was not criminally charged. The evidence of his direct involvement in the manufactured assessments was strong but not legally sufficient for prosecution under the territorial statutes as they then stood, and his lawyers argued that his land office employee had acted without his direct authorization, which was technically possible and could not be definitively disproven. He paid substantial civil penalties, lost his influence at the land office, and within 2 years had substantially reduced his operations in the territory and moved the bulk of his business interests to Texas, which Charlotte considered an adequate if imperfect outcome. She told Clarence her assessment one evening when Elias was asleep and the clinic was quiet, and he listened to the whole of it, the careful accounting of what had been achieved and what had fallen short, and when she was finished he said, "The families who have their land back will be on it for generations. That is not nothing." "No," she said, "it is not nothing. It is considerable, I know that." She was quiet. "I wanted it to be complete." "Nothing is ever complete," he said. "That is the uncomfortable truth about the world. You do the best that can be done and then you keep going." She looked at him. "You have become considerably more philosophical since we married." "You are an excellent influence," he said. She smiled, which was still the most valuable thing he regularly earned in the world. The years settled into the rhythms of a life built rather than drifted through, which was the distinction that mattered to Clarence in ways he was still discovering. He had found work as Redrock's deputy sheriff when Harris asked him, having assessed over the previous year that Clarence was both capable and possessed of the particular quality of judgment that law enforcement in a complex community required. It was work that suited his skills and his values in a way that the drifting work never had, and it kept him present in the community where Charlotte's work was centered and connected him to the network of relationships she had built. He was good at the job. He was patient and fair, and he had a way of resolving conflicts that moved them toward resolution rather than escalation, a skill that Charlotte identified as coming from his long experience of being in places where violence was always possible, and therefore understanding the particular value of the alternatives. Harris retired in 1891 and the county elected Clarence sheriff, which was an outcome that he found genuinely surprising and Charlotte found entirely predictable. "You are the most trusted person in the county after me," she said, without false modesty because Charlotte did not practice false modesty, "and I am not eligible to hold office." "That will eventually change," he said. "Eventually is doing substantial work in that sentence," she said. "But yes." Their second child was born in 1892, a girl named Josephine, who arrived in December with the same strong lungs as her brother, and a quality of attentiveness from her first days that Charlotte recognized as familiar, and which made her laugh with a delight that she did not try to suppress. "She is watching everything," Clarence said, standing over the small person who was in fact watching everything with dark eyes that were already focused in a way that seemed improbable for someone 3 days old. "Yes," Charlotte said, "she will be very annoying to argue with in 15 years. She will be remarkable," he said. Elias, who was 6, regarded his sister with the complicated assessment of a child processing the arrival of permanent change in his household, and after approximately 2 weeks of evaluation, declared that she was acceptable and that he would teach her to ride when she was old enough, which Charlotte confirmed with Clarence was the highest endorsement available from that particular source. The clinic expanded in 1893, when Charlotte's practice had grown to the point that the original building was genuinely insufficient. The county contributed funds toward the expansion in recognition of her service, and several of the Canyon country families contributed labor, and Thomas Runningwaiter's son, who had grown into his father's carpentry skills, built Charlotte a proper examination room and a room that served as both office and library, and was large enough to hold all the books she had accumulated in 8 years of practice. The drawing of the canyon stayed above her desk in the new room, moved carefully from the old. She had added to it over the years, a series of smaller drawings pinned around the original different angles and seasons, the canyon in the particular gold of late summer, and the canyon in the blue-white of winter, and the canyon in the green flush that followed the monsoons and turned the red rock walls briefly lush. He had framed the original for her 5th anniversary, and she had cried, very briefly, in the Charlotte Keene way that involved approximately 30 seconds of visible emotion, and then a return to composure that was not quite complete for the rest of the day. Clarence kept the fact of those 30 seconds close, a private thing, one of many. The summer of 1894 brought an unusual case. A man came into Redrock on a Thursday morning in August, having ridden up from the south, looking for a healer, with a wound that was infected beyond the ordinary scope of trail medicine. He was perhaps 35 and carried himself like someone who had been moving fast and sleeping badly for some time, and when Charlotte came out to the clinic's front room and saw him, she moved immediately into her assessment mode. She cleaned and dressed the wound with the focused attention she gave all her patients, and she gave him her usual combination of treatment and explanation. And as the man was thanking her in the overspecific way of someone who has recently understood that the alternative to this moment was quite bad, He asked her how long she had been practicing in Rock. She told him 8 years. He said he had heard of her as far south as the Mexican border. That word had traveled through the canyon country and across the territory. That her name meant something specific to people who lived in places where medical help was scarce. Clarence was in the doorway to the back of the clinic and heard this, and watched Charlotte receive it with the same careful containment she applied to everything important. And then she said simply, "I am glad to be useful." And it was exactly true. He went out the back and stood in the yard behind the clinic for a moment and looked at the canyon rim in the distance and thought about ropes. He thought about the rope coming across his chest in the flood, the essential improbability of it, the absolute narrowness of the margin between the life he was living now and no life at all. He thought about the woman who had been on the rim in the right place with the right equipment and the right skill and the right character to act without hesitation. He thought about how many threads had to be exactly right to create that moment, and how the moment had created everything after it. He thought he would find Charlotte and tell her this, not because she did not know it, but because some things deserved to be said aloud. He found her finishing the notes on the man's case at her desk, the afternoon light coming through the window in the way it did in August, warm and specific. And Elias was at school and Josephine was asleep in the back room, and the clinic was quiet. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up. He told her what he had been thinking about in the yard, about ropes and margins and everything after. He told her it simply and directly because she was a woman who received directness well and preferred it to circumlocution. She listened to all of it and then she said, "I have thought about it also, more often than I have said." "What do you think when you think about it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think that I threw that rope toward a stranger because a person was drowning and I had a rope and the skill to use it. I was not thinking about consequences beyond the immediate one. I was not thinking about what might follow." She looked at him. "But if I had known everything that would follow every day of the 8 years after, I would have thrown it with considerably more intention." He came around the desk and pulled her to her feet and kissed her in the afternoon light, and she kissed him back with the same thorough attention she gave everything that mattered. "Good," he said. "Yes," she agreed. By 1896, Rock had grown by another 100 people, and had acquired a proper school and a telegraph office and a bank. All the institutions of a town that has decided it is permanent. Charlotte's clinic had trained 2 younger healers, one a young woman named Frances who had come to her as an apprentice in the manner of Charlotte's own apprenticeship with Keene, and one a young Navajo man named Samuel whose medical knowledge was already substantial from his family's tradition, and who was expanding it in directions that Charlotte found genuinely exciting to observe. She was building something. She had been building it for years, and it was taking shape now as something that would continue beyond her own practice, which was what she had intended from the beginning. She told Clarence, though she had not said so explicitly. "I did not want to build a clinic," she said one evening when Elias and Josephine were both in bed and the house was quiet. "I wanted to build a practice in the larger sense, a way of caring for people in this place that would persist." "It will persist," he said. He said it with the certainty of someone who has watched something be built from its foundation and can assess the structural integrity. She leaned against him on the small sofa they had acquired for the sitting room, which had not existed as a concept in the clinic's original form, but which had been created by necessity as the space was adapted to being a home rather than simply a workplace. He put his arm around her and she settled against him in the way she had settled into almost everything in their life together, with intention and completeness without remainder. "Clarence," she said. "Yes. I want another child," she said. It was very direct, but then she always was. He was quiet for a moment. "How many children are you planning on?" "I am not planning on a specific number," she said. "I am indicating a current desire." He considered the household as it currently stood, Elias at 9 and Josephine at 4, the clinic and the practice and the expanding network of canyon country connections. his own work as sheriff, the life they had built with its specific textures and rhythms. He thought about all of this. Yes, he said. Their third child, another son, was born in 1897, and they named him James, for no particular historical reason except that it suited him, which they knew approximately 2 hours after his birth. James was the easiest child in their household and the loudest about his preferences, a combination that Charlotte described as a practical paradox and that Clarence found consistently entertaining. Elias was 12 by the time James was walking, old enough to take his brotherly responsibilities seriously and young enough to find them genuinely fun. Josephine was 5 and had acquired the habit of following Charlotte through the clinic and watching everything she did, with the focused attention Charlotte had noted at her birth. And there were already conversations in the household about what education would be available and when and how. Charlotte was clear that her daughter would have every opportunity to pursue medicine if that was her interest, or anything else she chose, with equal thoroughness. Clarence was clear that this would be managed regardless of what obstacles the world put in the way of it, and that he had some experience with obstacles and was not concerned. The century turned with the Monroe household firmly rooted in Red Rock, which had become the kind of town that people came to rather than pass through, which had its own character and its own specific identity that was different from the standard frontier pattern of boom and movement. The clinic was a significant part of that character. Charlotte Keene Monroe had been treating patients in the Canyon country for 13 years, and her practice was woven into the community in ways that were structural rather than superficial. Clarence was in his 14th year as a lawman in one capacity or another, and had developed a reputation that reached beyond the county, the particular reputation of someone who was both competent and principled, which was not always the same person. They were sitting on the porch of the clinic on a Sunday evening in August of 1900, exactly 13 years and almost to the week after the flood in Red Mesa Gorge, when Elias came out and stood in the doorway and looked at his parents on the porch in the particular way of a 15-year-old assessing adult behavior. "What are you looking at?" he said. "The canyon," Charlotte said, "as we often do on Sunday evenings." "You're not looking at the canyon," Elias said. "You're looking at each other and occasionally at the canyon." "That is also accurate," Clarence said. Elias considered this. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's patient quality of observation, and a considerable native intelligence that had been the subject of extensive educator correspondence with Santa Fe about appropriate advanced opportunities. He was at the age where he found his parents simultaneously comprehensible and mysterious, which was an accurate reading of the situation. "Thomas Runningwaiter's son says you were the first healer in this part of the territory who treated everyone the same regardless of who they were," Elias said. "He says that is why the Canyon families trust us." Charlotte looked at her son. "There is more history to it than that," she said. "The trust was built over time and through specific actions, not simply through a general disposition. But yes, that was the foundation. And Pa helped," Elias said. "Your father helped," Charlotte agreed, "significantly and at some personal risk." Elias looked at his father. "You worked for Garrett before you knew he was bad." "For a few weeks," Clarence said, "long enough to understand what was happening. And then you helped Ma." "Yes, because you loved her." Clarence and Charlotte looked at each other. "Because it was right," Clarence said. "And yes, because I loved her. Those two things happen to point in the same direction, which is the best kind of luck." Elias absorbed this. "Thomas's son also says Ma saved your life before any of that," he said. "He says she roped you out of the flood." Charlotte's mouth curved. "That is accurate," she said. "He makes it sound like it was difficult," Elias said. "Was it difficult?" Charlotte considered. "The throw was not particularly difficult," she said. "The current was strong, but the distance was manageable. The technique I used distributes the strain through the saddle horn effectively." She paused. The part that required judgment was recognizing the correct moment and calculating the trajectory accurately despite the poor visibility. Elias looked at his father. She is saying it was not hard. She is saying that for her, in that moment, the skills were equal to the situation, Clarence said. That is not the same as saying it was simple. He paused. She is the finest person I have ever encountered in any territory, and I have encountered quite a few. Charlotte turned to look at him with an expression that was still, 13 years in, capable of arriving at him with the force of something unexpected. "Go help your sister with the supper," she told Elias, who disappeared inside with the sound of a young person whose mission has been accomplished. The porch was quiet. The canyon rim was purple in the evening light, and the sky above it was the specific orange of late summer sunset, the kind that seemed to justify everything difficult about living in the desert, every scorching afternoon and bone-dry winter, because occasionally the sky did this. "The finest person you have ever encountered," she said. "In any territory," he confirmed. "You have been in many territories." "I have," he said. "That is what gives the assessment its precision." She reached over and took his hand, and he held it, and they sat on the porch of the clinic that was their home and watched the canyon country go from gold to purple to the deep blue of evening, and the specific sounds of their children preparing supper came through the open door behind them. And James, at 3, was objecting to something in the clear and articulate way of a child who has learned that his opinions are worth voicing. And Josephine was managing the objection with a calm that was very familiar. And Elias was commenting on both with the dry observation of someone practicing adulthood. The Garrett case had concluded years ago, and the families who had lost land had regained most of it. And Frances was running her own clinic in the next county. And Samuel was building a practice that combined the medical traditions of his people with the Western medicine Charlotte had taught him in ways that were producing results that impressed everyone who understood either tradition. The legal network that Charlotte had built was being used in other parts of the territory by other people with similar problems, adapted and extended by the Santa Fe firm that had become genuinely committed to the issue. The work continued. It always would. Clarence Monroe looked at the canyon rim and thought about the specific margin of the flood, the rope, the sandstone crumbling under his fingers one grain at a time. He thought about the woman who had been on the rim with a rope, and the skill to throw it and the character to act without hesitation. He thought about how completely and permanently that moment had redirected the course of everything. He had been drifting. He had been drifting for years, moving through places and leaving them, accumulating experience but not belonging, skilled at survival and entirely at sea about anything more than that. And then the flood. And then Charlotte Keene, standing 6 feet back from the canyon's edge with her rope coiled and her green eyes performing a medical assessment of his entire waterlogged and grateful person, mildly irritated, absolutely competent, asking him whether anything was broken. Nothing was broken. Nothing important. In fact, something that had been broken for a long time had been in the process of being repaired from that moment forward, by the specific quality of a woman who did not try to fix what was not hers to fix, but who was simply so thoroughly and completely herself that being near her made the world more comprehensible and better worth inhabiting. He was 52 years old in that year of 1900, and he had been home for 13 years. He turned to Charlotte, who was watching the same sky with the same quality of attention she gave everything, reading it, knowing its patterns, understanding its language. "I would do it all again," he said. She turned to look at him. "The flood, all of it," he said. "Every piece of it, all the drifting that brought me to the canyon at exactly the wrong time and exactly the right time, because it brought me here." He gestured, the same economical sweep she had used years ago, taking in the clinic and the canyon and the children inside, and the life that had been built between two people who had arrived at the same moment from entirely different directions. "This is where I was going. I just did not know it." Charlotte Monroe was quiet for a moment in the way of someone receiving something important and holding it properly. "Yes," she said, "this is where we were going." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the last light of the summer evening. And the canyon country spread before them in all its specific and indifferent beauty. And behind them, their children's voices were the sound of the life they had built together, complicated and imperfect and entirely, completely worth everything it had cost to arrive at it. James called out for his mother, and Charlotte stood with the easy grace she had always had, pressed her hand to Clarence's face briefly in a gesture that said everything and needed no translation, and went inside to the sound of him. Clarence sat alone on the porch for another minute and looked at the canyon rim, where the first stars were appearing in the deep blue above the orange edge of the gone sun. He thought, "I was drowning." He thought, "And she had a rope." He thought, "And here we are." The stars continued to appear, one by one, the way they always did and always would, over the canyon country and the clinic that was a home and the family that had been built from the improbable intersection of a flood and a rope and two people who were, when all the circumstances had finished arranging themselves, exactly right for each other. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every specific and unmistakable detail, everything.